Okay, so I think we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Responsible Aluminium Sourcing Roundtable, the case of the automotive value chain. My name is Catalina Pislaru, and here at CSR Europe, I'm responsible for managing different projects related to supply chain sustainability. And I will be the moderator of the session today. This session is organized by Drive Sustainability, and I will also now tell you why exactly we are having this session today. So we are having this session because Drive Sustainability, and you see the companies that are representing Drive Sustainability. Drive Sustainability is working to develop a common approach towards sustainable raw materials. And actually, I hear myself with an echo. Sorry for that. Okay, so I think now it's better. Sorry for that. We have some, as always, some technicalities. So I was just saying why we have the session today. So it is because Drive Sustainability that works on different priorities also works to develop a common approach towards sustainable raw materials. And later on, you will hear from my colleagues more about this. But also what is important to know now at the beginning of this session is that today, Drive Sustainability is launching the Raw Materials Outlook. What is the Raw Materials Outlook? It's actually an online risk assessment tool that automotive companies can use, for instance, for individual further due diligence in the supply chain or individual sustainable sourcing activities, but also Drive Sustainability can use for further collective action. And in the same time, the purpose of the Drive Sustainability Raw Materials Outlook is to serve as a basis for dialogue between, on the one hand, the automotive companies, and on the other hand, with other stakeholders on, for instance, certain commodities or certain issues related to supply chain sustainability and responsible sourcing. Today, we want to have a discussion about aluminium. And this is why I would now like to introduce the agenda to you, because in order for us to have a discussion about the sustainable aluminum sourcing in the value chain, we planned a session today about 1 hour and a half, where basically there are two parts. In the first part is more introduction from our side and more presentations from our side to you. So first we will have a presentation about the EU policy framework that we are that applies to all, let's say, the European companies and not only. Then we will focus more on the automotive example and on the automotive industry, and we will share with you more information about Drive Sustainability and the overall approach to raw materials. After that, we will have another presentation where we will actually show you the results of the aluminium value chain and the risk assessment that we have conducted. So this is the first part of the discussion today. And then in the second part of the discussion, we will have a more interactive session. We will have a panel discussion where different companies and different organizations will basically reflect on what was just presented, and we'll have a further discussion about how to use the raw materials outlook for further sustainability purposes. And after that, we will do a short closing. You see that there are also some moments for Q&As. And now I want to show you how actually you can be part of the discussion today. You all see that there is a live discussion box where you have the option to chat with all the participants, and you have the option to ask questions. So please do not hesitate to put your questions there while we are moving ahead, and we will take them later. Also, there is the option for you to connect with any speaker or any other attendee in the networking tab. And also, then if you are more interested in finding out more information about CSR Europe projects, you can have a look at the CSR Europe toolbox. So I think this is it for the introduction. And now I would like to kick off the presentations. And the first presenter is Maria Nyberg, Policy Officer at DG GROW, European Commission. Maria will explain us the EU agenda on sourcing and raw materials. So Maria, I see you already on the floor, on the screen. I give the floor to you now, and I will move the slides for you.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Can you hear me well? Good afternoon, and good afternoon to you all. I hope you have the first slide on the screen. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here at this SDG Roundtable. Actually, I would like to ask you to change slide straight away, if you don't mind. Thank you. The batteries regulation that we proposed end of last year is an important building block when we discuss responsible supply chains. I will get to that more in a minute, but there's another thing that I wanted to mention first, which relates to permanent magnets in electric vehicles. A couple of weeks ago, the European Raw Materials Alliance, ERMA, called out for a number of actions needed to secure access to rare earth magnets and motors for European industry going green and digital. ERMA addresses the entire value chain and asks for more transparency and sustainability. They ask for that the EU should promote ethical sourcing and transparency in the rare earths value chain. OEMs should track their supply chain and provide certified information on environmental and social standards in the production of rare earth magnets and motors. So this call out from on behalf of ERMA, it's a priority list, really. It's a wish list, and it is now for European policymakers, member states, and OEMs and others to take this into account. Slide 3, please. Policy context. The European Green Deal is our strategy to become a climate neutral continent based on green energy, a digitized and circular economy. This ambitious goal will require significant changes in our economies and supply chains, including raw material supply chains. A key element for this is access to sustainable resources. We need to decouple the green and digital transition from negative environmental and social impacts associated with necessary technology materials, including through promoting responsible and sustainable sourcing of raw materials. The update of the 2020 industrial strategy that we presented in May this year addresses our dependency on a limited number of third countries for raw materials and includes an analysis of EU strategic dependencies. We need to increase resilience of EU raw material supply chains. So what does this mean? It means that we need swift action on 3 strategic fronts: sustainable mining, responsible sourcing from a diversity of resource-rich third countries, and boosting circularity. This goes for all raw materials, including base metal, but it's even more necessary and important for critical raw materials. Slide 4, please. The action plan on critical raw materials that we presented 1 year ago builds on 10 actions to build precisely this: resilient EU value chains and open strategic autonomy, while at the same time being more circular and reducing environmental and social impacts of resource use. Responsible sourcing and mining is a main building block in the action plan, and actions 9 and 10 are about strategic partnerships, EU regulatory framework, and international cooperation. Slide 5, please. Regulatory framework. I already mentioned our horizontal transparency of supply chains initiative, the Sustainable Corporate Governance, which is foreseen for 2021. This will include corporate due diligence in terms of human rights violation and environmental harm with a horizontal approach. It comes from the Green Deal, which sets out that sustainability should be further embedded into the corporate governance framework. Work is ongoing on this policy proposal, and we would see an ambitious approach on due diligence as a means for building a culture of no harm among EU industry and businesses by putting in place mandatory horizontal due diligence obligations based on international standards. We are looking at supporting measures for companies to the legislative proposal, and the recognition of existing industry and other schemes and initiatives, like, for example, the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, are being considered under this proposal. There is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive from April this year that sets requirements on reporting of the due diligence process. There is the EU regulation on conflict minerals for EU-based importers, which is in application since January this year, ensuring that minerals are sourced responsibly and that supply chains don't help to fund armed conflict or illegal practices. So here, environmental risk is not addressed. And Catalina, if you could please click on the link that you see on slide 5, the EU portal. So this is just to show you that we have set up a portal to help SMEs specifically to perform a supply chain due diligence, and it builds on the responsible minerals regulation, but it is not solely relevant for that. It also takes into account other minerals and metals such as battery raw materials. So please check out this tool, which we hope can be of use, and that we will also update to take into account forthcoming legislative developments. If we go back to slide 5 again, there is the EU batteries regulation of last year. It's a milestone that sets clear rules for batteries to perform and be produced sustainably. So our proposal addresses the entire battery life cycle, from transparent supply chains for battery raw materials based on OECD due diligence guidelines to provisions for recycling and material recovery, minimum recycled content for future batteries. This proposal requires the economic operator that places industrial and EV batteries on the EU market to set up a supply chain due diligence policy to address both social and environmental risk. IT technologies would enable traceability through the life cycle. And it is cobalt, natural graphite, lithium nickel, and chemical compounds based on these raw materials that are in scope, and this is subject of future review. This proposal for the batteries regulation is now with the co-legislators, and adoption is foreseen for next year. I also want to say that don't miss an interesting seminar within the Raw Materials Week 2021 on the 18th November that we are arranging with Canada on the subject tracing sustainable battery minerals. Last slide, please, Catalina. So to sum up, I wanted to show the importance of raw materials for the green and digital transition that Europe has embarked upon, where the Green Deal is our main vehicle for change. And I mentioned a number of regulatory proposals and supporting measures to promote sustainable and responsible sourcing of raw materials, and the CRM action plan, how they concretely respond to the Green Deal resource challenge. increasing access to sustainable and responsible raw materials, that is not a solo task for the European Commission. We also need you. We need a partnership with member states, industry, civil society, academia, and others. We all need to do more. And we are really happy to see that there are many parties joining efforts in a number of areas, and very interesting proposal that you have been preparing for the Drive Sustainability Raw Materials Initiative at CSR Europe. And we contribute, and we look forward to working more closely with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Maria, for the presentation. It's quite an impressive outlook of regulation that the Commission has out there. I just wanted to ask if you will stay with us till the end of the session for any questions from the panelists.
I will try to stay as long as I can.
Okay, good. So now, because we are actually a little bit behind schedule, I will actually propose to move ahead, and I would recommend all the attendees that might have questions for Maria to put them in the questions box there, and we will collect them and pass them later. But now I would actually like to move ahead to the next presentations. And after we have heard from the European Commission about the impressive landscape, as I said, of regulation, now we want to move more to a more focused discussion to understand better the automotive industry and the approach towards sustainable raw materials at sectorial level. And for that, we have invited Franziska Kilikesh. Franziska is part of the Volkswagen team, and Volkswagen co-chaired the raw materials working group in Drive Sustainability. So today she will mainly speak on behalf of Drive Sustainability. And after that, we will hear from Rosanna Tuffo, specialist responsible business and development of Levin Sources. Levin Sources is our partner for the raw materials outlook, and Rosanna will actually explain more in depth what we are launching today, the methodology and the findings for the aluminium. But let's start with Franziska. Okay, so Franziska, you have the floor, and I will move the slides for you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good, because I have some delays, but I try not to let this distract me. So yeah, thank you very much for having me on the call today. I'm proud to talk to you about the activities that the Drive Sustainability has been put forward in the area of responsible raw material sourcing. Volkswagen is a founding member of the Drive Sustainability, and as we just heard, we have shared the raw materials working group over the last year or so. So please move forward with the presentation. So what I would like to just summarize for you who might not know the Drive Sustainability group so well is that Catalina showed you that we are the group of automotive companies, and we have defined for ourselves the mission of enhancing sustainability throughout the automotive supply chain by leveraging on common voice and by engaging with suppliers, stakeholders, and related sectors on impactful activities. And we want to achieve our mission by working on 5 strategic areas or strategic fields. I think the most important one is really this look at the entire supply chain, really from beginning to the end of life, and collaborating with our suppliers to move forward in our sustainability. And then the other strategic fields are sustainable raw materials, workforce well-being, carbon neutrality, and circular value chains. And the approach that we want to take in the industry initiative is really by engaging with stakeholders, being as transparent as possible, and also by leveraging best practices that are out there. Next slide, please. This slide wants to show you that the Drive Sustainability has not only thought about what we want to achieve, but also by when we want to achieve that. We have developed strategic milestones by 2025 and by 2030. And I'm just summarizing for you the work that we want to achieve on sustainable raw materials. And this is really, we want to come to a common audit and multi-mineral standard endorsement by 2030. And we want to reach optimal transparency and traceability. And we want to impact key projects successfully. We want to finish them successfully. And this all starts when you look back at the goals that we want to achieve by 2025 by promoting the usage of common standardized tools and methods. And I think what is important is to understand before we can decide on what tools do we need to positively impact raw material supply chains, we need to better understand the supply chains that we have in our supply chains. Next slide, please. And this is really where the Raw Materials Outlook platform comes into play, because this is basically an analysis of raw material supply chains and their ESG risks. And this is not the first work that Drive Sustainability is doing in this direction. I think a very fundamental work that we have been doing was the 2018 report, which was published by the Drive Sustainability together with the Responsible Minerals Initiative. This was the Material Change Report, where we already had a lot of ESG profiles for raw materials. And this report, I can just talk about the experience from Volkswagen, has been a very valuable resource for the automotive industry to really identify priority raw materials. We have been using this in our first step of establishing an OECD compliance due diligence management system. And since then, Volkswagen, we are also reporting on the priority raw materials that we have identified through the help of this study. And so this, I think, was very fundamental for the setup of a lot of human rights due diligence activities at the different companies. And obviously, this didn't trigger only individual action, but it also triggered collective action. And at the level of the Drive Sustainability Initiative, we had, for example, on certain risk areas, we had common outreach to stakeholders. On other risk areas, we had common learning sessions. And this, again, was a very, very valuable impact for us also to collaboratively better understand the risks that are there in the supply chains. Now we are 3 years after 2018, and we are very happy that the Drive Sustainability can today launch a new version of the Material Change Report. Rosanna is going to talk about the differences, because it's actually not the same methodology. It's much more. It is very enhanced, or it is different, and Rosanna is going to explain that. But we particularly like about the new platform that it is not a static one, but it is an online platform. It's easy to reach and to use for a lot of stakeholders. And next slide, please. And what I think is really important, again, from the view of the members of the Drive Sustainability, again, we want to use the new information that is now out there through the Sustainable Raw Material Outlook, to use that for individual level activity, as it is our responsibility defined by the OECD and UN guiding principles. But we want also to use that to move ahead with common action within the Drive Sustainability group. Because a lot of the challenges that we obviously see in raw material supply chains are a collective challenge that we all have. And within the working group on raw materials, we are continuing collaborative action. And with that, I would like to finish here and hand over to Rosanna to dive into the presentation of the outlook.
Thank you, Francisca, for the presentation. Just a quick remark for the audience, as we are now speaking about the raw material outlook, and Rosanna Tufo from Living Sources will actually present it. I encourage you all to have a look at it, and you can just Google rawmaterialoutlook.org, have a look at it to better understand what we are speaking about. So with this, I will pass the floor now to Rosanna to tell us about the raw materials outlook, the methodology, and how and the results for aluminium.
Thank you very much, Catalina. It's definitely a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I'm really delighted to present the raw material outlook further and use the bauxite and aluminium research outcomes to really show what it is about and what kind of information can be found there. So at Living Sources, we really had the pleasure of supporting drive sustainability over the past months through the raw materials analysis and the realization of the outlook. So for those who might not be familiar with Living Sources, just briefly, we're a social venture and consultancy firm really specializing on responsible mineral supply chains, working across different geographies and minerals, and really focusing on both the mineral governance and policy side, as well as the responsible and sustainable business conduct for producing companies, such as also the sourcing companies. So next slide, please. So I won't pause too much on to tell you what the raw material outlook is, because I think both Catalina and Francisca have already given that. What I'll do, I'll try to move more into how it came together. So how was it built, and also use some of the results from aluminium to show you some examples. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go into as much detail in all the elements, which would all reserve a presentation for itself, but I'll try to touch upon some of the most salient issues. Next slide, please. So looking at, from a methodological point of view, the first and most important thing is to say that it was really built on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as the main framework for risk identification and assessment. And of course, these two actions represent the first steps of due diligence in responsible supply chains. One of the things that really we try to look at, and following also the ambition of Drive to really look at the entire supply chain, was to have a value chain approach to the analysis. This means really mapping each material, and also aluminium, of course, throughout its journey from extractions into its application and even the recycling stage, including some of the cross-cutting stages, as we will see, such as the trading, the transport, the warehousing, which often represent areas where we identify as having blind spots, or areas where risks are not really looked into. So we really tried and made attempts to look into that as well. In practice, what this value chain mapping approach has given us is really the chance to understand a more complete scope of the impacts, which does not only focus on mining facilities or processing facility, but really look at the overall landscape of the commodity, including identifying who are the key players, who are the key companies or actors with whom collaborate or to engage, also to exercise leverage to address some of these issues. So again, here connects the research aspect to it, but also starting identifying how this can move forward in terms of action. Naturally, a lot of the information at this stage is still very much heavy on the extraction areas and the processing, but taking this whole value chain approach has also given us the chance to identify where information is not available, where more analysis is needed, and also make some assumptions on potential risks. So again, this is really a core part of the methodology. So, but how did we go through the risk identification? So first and most importantly, by taking a value chain approach, we really aimed at describing each and every single step of the value chain by starting identifying also what are the potential or the actual risks that are technically linked to the material. What does this mean, technically linked? It means like that by default, because of how the commodity is extracted, the chemicals or the materials that are used for its processing, these pose some risks to the environment and to humans, through workers and communities. So this was really the first screening in terms of risks. The other was also understanding where, so going at a context level, where are these produced, where are the mines found, where the processing facility are, and so on, to understand are there risks that potentially linked to the broader regulatory environment or lack of regulatory environments. For example, we saw that very relevant when it comes to labor standards, so that we could make some assumptions, as I mentioned before, about risks that are not reported on yet, but definitely that have a high level of potential risk and therefore need monitoring. And finally, of course, this has also been based on actual reported and materialized impacts and risks, based on mainly on secondary resources, of course, and therefore we really understood, okay, what happens if these risks actually materialize, who gets affected, and what are the consequences of that. Once we have that, of course, then this leaves us with a lot of information and data to go to the next step from risk identification and really start doing the assessment. This is mainly done based on two important elements, also known with the UNGP approach, which is severity as a function of the scope, the scale, and the remediability of the impacts and the likelihood of the impacts. For the likelihood specifically, for the raw material outlook, what we looked into were the national context for the major producing countries, meaning that we identified what were the major indexes across the several impact areas or analysis that are done to identify how likely is a specific risk to happen in a country. And of course, that matched with the severity gave us a sense of what is the priority or what is the saliency of the specific risk. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, as I said, I will not go into all the details of what the platform contains, because otherwise that would take too much time, but I do suggest you to go and check it out on the raw materials outlook itself. Here, I will really just try to extract some of the key information, both from that more contextual aspect, so for bauxite and aluminium, but also then some of the major risks that were identified in some of the value chain stages. Again, we will not go in all of them for time purposes. Next slides, please. So this slide is just really a picture, again, a snapshot one that I will probably very quickly jump through, but just to show how we really looked at the different stages and how the material, in this case, the bauxite that then gets transformed and becomes aluminium, goes through the different stages of the value chain, including, you will see the recycling aspects. We looked at that very importantly, as it is an alternative source and then gets back into the value chain, but also the more cross-cutting stages, as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. So going into some of the data. Here, what you see in this slide is a snapshot of the section that we called market intelligence on the raw materials outlook. This is really supposed to provide that contextual background of what were the major players for a specific commodity. And in the case of bauxite and aluminium, for example, it really gave us an idea of how centralized the industry is, especially at these first stages of the value chain. In both the bauxite mining and aluminium refining, for example, when we look at the top producing countries, we have over 70% that it's actually among the top 4 producing countries. Very similar when we look at producing companies, we have the top 10, again, that really relate to or about 50 or even more than 50% of global production. So this, of course, was not only important for the identification of risks, because it helped us focus on specific countries or potentially also identifying operating companies, but also from an aspect of leverages and taking actions afterwards is really important, because it guides who are the players that need to be part of the conversation and or to potentially exercise leverage on. Next slide, please. So here now we start looking at the different risks identified for some of the value chain stages. We start, of course, with the bauxite mining because of its very relevance. And looking at the slides just from a very summarized point, of course, like the first instinct that probably comes is like, well, okay, of course, those are potential impacts or actual impacts of the mining industry at large, especially when we look at industrial mining or also large-scale mining. However, as I mentioned before, the analysis has gone further, and I'll try to explain how some of these risks were actually identified for bauxite specifically. So starting from the air emissions in general, and what does it mean in terms of general air quality management around the mining concessions? Of course, it was identified that besides the greenhouse gas emissions, which could be related to the use of large diesel-powered vehicles or the general plant consumption, there are also other emissions such as dust that can be generated and have impact on the environment as well as on the community. Before looking at the community side of this, I also would like to mention how the air emission aspect is linked to the overall energy use at the mining stage. So we looked into try to identify to which extent renewable energy, for example, is already used at the mining of bauxite to see how the footprint potentially of mining bauxite is being reduced. Unfortunately, it was very hard to say, well, there is this percentage, for example, that is using renewable. However, it's something that technology is starting being there. The extent of its application is still hard to tell, but of course the alternatives are there. So this is very important to look at the other side of the air emissions when we talk about, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. At least dust will need to be managed differently. As said, I touched briefly upon when we talk about emissions and not only the other big areas of impacts, either because of where bauxite mining takes place, or in general also because of reported incidents, community rights are being affected and have been affected quite a large and through different areas. We started by identifying, of course, impacts on health and safety. When we discussed the emissions, of course, that means also potential impacts in the health of people from a respiratory diseases point of view, but also other broader impacts, such as how mining and the mining of bauxite specifically that happens on quite extensive lands, as it mainly surface mining, can potentially impact the livelihoods of communities when it touches on agricultural resources or water resources, and in general, like the use of soil. Receptacle and residential rights also identified as unfortunately violations which have been recorded also in countries such as Guinea, Brazil, and China. So again, the three of them are among the major producing countries, so definitely making this risk as a clear material one. As mentioned, of course, the fact that bauxite is done mainly on the surface and therefore touches upon important quantities of soil and land, it has also impacts in terms of the general land usage, potential conflict with agricultural land, generating overall conflicts in communities, and of course impacts from an environmental side also in terms of biodiversity. Again, what is really important here to see, and we really see this pattern throughout the analysis, is that many environmental impacts, in fact, they always have the other side of the coin, which are very much like impacts on communities, on workers. So we really try to explain where these linkages were there. We really try to explain through the analysis and analyze them. Last two aspects, very importantly, one is occupational offensivity. I won't expand too much on this because, again, of course, we all know that OHS for the mining industry is a major priority, and there are numerous standards, not only in bauxite, but in general in the industry that are developed and should be applied. But however, the research has shown that cases of failure of applying these standards still take place, and therefore the topic and the risk in general remains quite important for the industry. Lastly, on the bauxite mining, another impact that was identified was linked to the water use during the mining process, and specifically the bauxite processing. While this represents a risk which would be technically manageable, because we try to identify also when this risk are technically manageable and when they fail to do so. However, these impacts can still happen at communities level, especially when it impacts the access to water of communities. In some cases, it was also identified that this can link to indirect impacts. For example, when bauxite mining calls for the need for wider infrastructure projects such as dam development. And then we saw some instances where the communities were negatively affected by dam projects, which were quite driven by bauxite mining needs. So again, looking at those impacts a little bit beyond just what happens at the mine site. So next slide, please. Moving on to the alumina refining and aluminium smelting stage, we look at these two together, although in the raw material outlook you'll find them separately, because this part of the value chain is often vertically integrated. So some of the risk, or the majority of the risk, are quite common across the two. So as per the mining, but actually a much larger scale, the air emissions and in general pollution is quite important for the processing of aluminium. First, because these processes depend on high temperature, and therefore air pollutants are released in the atmosphere, including significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, if these emissions are not properly managed, of course, impacts are generated not only on the health and safety of workers directly, but of communities and the environment. So this again links quite straightforward on that community rights area, right? When communities that are around the concession, in this case on the processing facilities, can have direct impacts, again, specific on respiratory diseases linked to the management of these very impacts at the facility. Also, in some cases, overall community engagement and residential rights were identified as part of the risks, as in some instances there have been conflicts, for example, not only for the actual impacts, but even for perceived impact. So again, this becomes something that deserves monitoring and follow-up in the cases where it has materialized. No need to mention, of course, that if communities are affected by potentially the emissions and the hazards that can happen to the processing of aluminium and alumina, workers who are very much more directly in contact with the facility also have specific risks. And in the case that the standards are not applied, of course, the risks materialize, and that leads to consequences either in the short or longer term from a health perspective. And finally, another major risk area, especially for the processing, what happens is that at this stage, important waste and wastewater are generated. Particular attention should be posed to the residue of alumina refining, which is called red mud, which also can have quite negative impacts if this is not disposed properly, and it's recognized as hazardous waste together with other smelting receipts from the smelting activities. And several of these risks have actually been reported specifically and largely in China, and to some extent also in Brazil. Next slide, please. And I'll try to summarize a bit further in the interest of time. But yet here, just a note on the recycling stage. As I said, I wanted to jump directly at the very end, almost at the value chain, to show how the recycling stage has been tackled. So first, we looked at it from for the very important role that recycling has to play in terms of alternative source from mined material, and in general as contributor to more circular industry, and also in terms of reducing air emissions at large, and of course working towards more energy efficiency. However, we do not want to stop there, and we try to understand what are the sources also of the scrap material that then goes into the recycling process. And there some impacts have been identified, especially when we talk about occupational health and safety, broader workers' rights, the management of some of the waste that comes from the scrap collections, and in general also how the recycling and scrap collection is organized, as often it can interlink to informal or even illegal activities. Now, in some circumstances here, it was possible to link some of the risks specifically to aluminium, especially when we talk about shipbreaking activities. However, in some other instances, to the extent to which these risks linked to aluminium specifically deserves more research and more analysis. And finally, next slide. Again, this is like looking more at the transport, trading, and logistic aspects, supporting the statements that we made at the beginning, to really try to look beyond just the mining facilities, the processing facility, but looking also at what happens in between the value chain stages. And of course, for example, if we look at transport, there are clear impacts that derive from that, from the very obvious CO2 emissions that come from the transport to broader occupational health and safety, workers and human rights, especially in terms of employment, and general like incidents that can occur, for example, when transporting some of the material that gets wrongly displaced into the environment, affecting communities and the surrounding environment. Of course, this is based on also on reported risks and not only to what is potential. So again, this is how it becomes relevant to the bauxite and aluminium value chain. And then next and last slide from my hand. So apologies if it felt like rushing a little bit through the presentation, but really wanted to give some of the key points and really keen to leave the space also for the discussion afterwards. I really hope that this brief overview gave you a sense of what the raw material outlook contains and how it came about. I would like just to conclude on the note that both Catalina and Francisca mentioned before on how how there is going to be some work building on the RMO. First, from a further prioritization and identification and prioritization of risks, and then also from a more stakeholder engagement and collaborative action, let it be with industry initiatives, affected parties or their proxies, or even other value chain actors themselves. So once again, thank you very much for having us and looking forward for the discussions.
Thank you, Rosanna, for the presentation. It's quite a lot of information and data there to understand and digest. So what I propose to do next is to move to the panel discussion. We shared the main research findings with the panelists before, so they can prepare a little bit. And let me see here. Also to find the right slides. Yes. So without further ado, I propose that we move to the more interactive part now. After we have heard more about the regulatory framework, about drive sustainability in general, and the results of the outlook. Now, as I said, we would like to hear from different either stakeholder parties or other organizations that might be interested in the aluminium value chain. What is their opinion on this? But actually for this, I have the pleasure to hand over to Johannes. Johannes Dans is part of a Daimler team and Daimler co-chaired the raw materials working group in 2021 for drive sustainability, and he will moderate the discussion. So Johannes, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Catalina, and good afternoon also from my side. As Catalina already mentioned, I had the great pleasure to co-chair the raw materials work group at Drive Sustainability, and that for 1.5 years now, and that really relates to the entire development period of the raw materials outlook. So it's not just saying that it's a great pleasure to chair this here today. It's really meaning it, having been involved from the early days of conceptual sketches, and that were really about knowledge building amongst the participating OEMs up until now, when we have something that is out in the open and will actually serve as a point of departure for a stronger stakeholder engagement that Drive Sustainability will put forward beginning next year. So in a sense, the work is only beginning now, but it's great to see the product already out there. What's the idea for the panel discussion that we're entering now? It's very much reflecting on what we've already heard. And as Catalina mentioned, our panelists also had the chance to look at the raw materials outlook beforehand, so they should have a bit of an opinion. And we have a very interesting and a diverse, in a sense of perspectives, panel with Samir Whittaker from Flora and Fauna International, Jim Warmington from Human Rights Watch, Henrik Wanfus from Argus Industry, and Marieke van der Meen from the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. So the idea for the next few minutes now is to give each of the panelists the opportunity to to say a few words of an introduction and really share his or her remarks on the raw materials outlook, with the specific focus, of course, on our case study, and that is the aluminium and bauxite value chain. We'll have a second round of questions then, and then hopefully have a few minutes left for a Q&A. So if anything crosses your mind during the conversation that we are about to have, please put these comments, questions, whatever you have in the chat, and we'll see that we can address them at the end of the session. But now, without further ado, I would like to hand over the word to the panelists, starting with Samir. Samir, if you just want to say, 2 or 3 sentences on what your primary focus of work is, and then obviously our most pressing question is, well, what is your assessment of the raw materials outlook? What's the impression that you got? And also, with that raw materials outlook published, where do you see the next steps to specifically address environmental risk issues in the aluminium supply chain? Over to you.
So thanks so much, Johannes. I'm getting a lot of lag on the video, so hopefully the sound is okay.
I think so, yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to ignore the video. So thanks again, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really, really great to be here. It's obviously a topic of great interest to us at Fauna and Flora International. So just for those of you that haven't heard of us before, we're the oldest international conservation organization in the world. And our headquarters are here in Cambridge in the UK. So our team specifically works on biodiversity, carbon, and social issues in the extractives and infrastructure sectors, including, of course, bauxite mining. And I've personally worked on these issues for about the past 15 years or so. So the session today is just, incredibly relevant. There's projected to be vastly increased demand for metals, including aluminium, projected, for example, for the automotive sector. And so the upstream activities, specifically bauxite mining, are going to play a central role in our society for the next sort of 50 years or so, according to kind of World Bank projections. So this is obviously really important to us at Fauna and Flora, as, for example, the mining industry itself contributes about 28% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2 are about 7%. And has only recently started sort of setting emissions reduction targets. Mining is also the 4th largest driver of deforestation globally. So it causes about 7% of deforestation. This number, I have to mention, is far higher in areas such as sub-Saharan Africa, where about 39% of all large-scale mining activity is occurring in forest landscapes. So if we assume sort of a 50-kilometer radial area of influence for large-scale mining sites such as bauxite, and the data, by the way, supports this and shows that it can extend up to 70 kilometers. So using this estimate, we see that about 30% of all forests globally are potentially influenced by large-scale mining. I'm using forests here as a proxy for biodiversity, recognizing that biodiversity exists in a range of other habitats, but for the space, for the sort of spatial modeling exercises, forest was one of the easiest to use. I just also mentioned that the situation is very different in different parts of the world. So just as an example, again, going to Africa, the sort of direct impacts of mining to deforestation is almost double the global average. And so 4 out of the 5 top countries for sort of forest-based mining exist in Africa. And I have to also say that bauxite is one of the top 10 metals that is products that is mined in forest areas globally. So just moving to the aluminium supply chain more specifically, we worked with 11 sources and other partners in 2019 on behalf of the World Bank Climate Smart Mining Program. And we put together an approach that that we were calling forest smart mining. And the initial analysis used forest cover data. And so one of the findings there was that up to 64% of all operational bauxite mines exist in forest. So extrapolating that out to all biodiversity, bauxite is clearly sort of extremely important from a risk and an opportunity side in terms of impacting biodiversity globally. So this has obvious implications for biodiversity, but it also has implications for companies. It has implications from the climate perspective for companies making net zero commitments who need to look down their supply chains to look at what sort of upstream emissions are. It has implications for jurisdictional and sort of national contributions, national emission reduction targets. And again, on the risks for companies themselves, CDP is estimating that close to $1 trillion in annual corporate turnover is at risk because of deforestation, just as an example. So this is clearly something that companies need to manage, need to take seriously, and we know that they are starting to do this. From a conservation perspective, it's our sort of role and our focus to ensure that companies are achieving extremely high, the highest possible environmental and social standards, and we need to do this to make sure that the sort of dual climate biodiversity crisis is not further compounded. So just kind of moving to the raw materials outlook, it's obviously a really important piece of work. Companies need this information to be able to scope and manage risks. So I thought it, for example, provides really useful summaries of where the key mining areas are located. So, thinking about southwestern Guinea, thinking about Northeast India or Eastern India, Odisha, Western Australia, Brazil, China, including summaries of which the sort of top producing companies are, Alcoa, Rusal, Rio Tinto. It also provides a short overview of impacts. As Rosanna was outlining earlier, a lot of bauxite deposits are relatively shallow. So open cast mining is therefore the most economical and technically feasible way to mine these deposits, which means that they necessarily create huge footprints. The area of the footprints are very rarely restored back to their original state. During mining, of course, we also saw that there's a range of impacts that occurs during mining, which can be massive. And this often causes permanent losses of biodiversity. These landscapes can rarely return to their original state. Finally, I think one of the really key pieces is the ability to use the raw materials outlook to be able to not only to scope the risks, but also to identify and engage with relevant stakeholders. That this is going to be crucial because all of this is going to need to be managed in partnership. I had a quick suggestion for the methodology, which would be to include timing and duration in the overall determination of risk severity. I think it just makes it more complete and also ensures alignment with the OECD pressure state response framework, for example. Also to mention that we have identified and quantified key areas of overlap between bauxite mining and biodiversity. And we could certainly provide this data to include in the raw materials outlook if that would be of interest. So one thing that really jumped out at me was the statement in the raw materials outlook that currently 7 million tons of aluminium are not recycled annually due to collection and processing losses. And this is going to increase to 17 million in 2050. And this just seems crazy to me. It's obviously a huge problem, but also a massive opportunity. Finally, I just wanted to talk about what the raw materials outlook doesn't currently do, which is, I suppose, out of its scope, which is what do you actually do about these impacts at the upstream level, for example. And I should mention that a lot of these are already built into the ASI performance standard. So our focus is on managing the impacts of upstream activities. So we advocate approaches that aim to achieve overall net positive outcomes for mining landscapes. And typically it follows these steps. So firstly, to assess and really understand what the broad socio-ecological landscape is where operations are, identifying conservation and restoration priorities, and defining limits, red lines, to impacts and mitigation. Secondly, to assess and understand the broader threats and pressures in the landscape that might be opportunities for a company to help manage. To then build sort of multi-scale impact assessments and mitigation planning, working with a number of other stakeholders in the landscape. And then finally, applying the mitigation hierarchy, which is really a standardized framework in the sector for impact management. But this to be done across a landscape and looking at landscape level targets. Again, bringing in kind of a coordinated and collaborative approach where it's key to understand who your stakeholders and who your partners are, and contribute towards landscape scale and possibly jurisdictional targets. So just to reiterate again, we need to be considering impacts and mitigation at a landscape scale. And then finally, I said finally already, but finally, we're seeing that there are major market players, people on this call today, market players like Umicore, Tesla, Apple, who are increasingly pushing for products from mines and smelting operations that are achieving high environmental and social standards. I just noticed the other day that MSCI, for example, have launched an ESG materiality map to provide a bit more transparency into ESG ratings. So these are all important ways to track progress and to track specifically to track company progress and commitments. And I think we really need to use this momentum now to make sure that companies are actually looking all the way down their value chains and considering what those primary impacts are and what they can do to manage them. So that's it from me for the moment, Johannes.
Thank you, Samir. That was a great assessment and certainly worthwhile listening to you. Lots of good points that will definitely play a role, especially when we think about how to build our engagement with the supply chain based on the information that is now out there. I think that's the most crucial part. I would now like to throw the ball over to Jim. Jim, you have conducted quite a bit of research on the consequences of bauxite mining on local communities. Your organization has repeatedly made the connection between bauxite mining and the automotive industry. You have recently published a study on the same issue. So I guess the question is to you quite simply. So what's needed? What do you see as a going forward? What do you see that is needed from the industry and maybe also from other stakeholders to make that connection to the local communities better than it used to be up until now?
Thanks, Johannes. I'm going to just check that my sound is working okay.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Well, thanks first of all to you and to everybody at Drive Sustainability, and congratulations for the launch of the Raw Materials Outlook. It's also great to hear about the progress on mandatory human rights due diligence at the EU level, which I think really underscores how important it is for the car industry to push forward with progress in responsible sourcing on aluminum and on other issues. As you said, Human Rights Watch and our partners, we've worked for several years with communities impacted by bauxite mining, particularly in Guinea and West Africa. And many of the things that Rosa and Samir have already spoken about really reflects what we've seen in our own work. We've seen how bauxite mining in Guinea is tearing up land and destroying water sources around villages that have relied on that land for generations, really threatening the way of life and the access to food and water of many, many communities. Guinea is also a real example of the way that politics can affect mining. There was a military coup in Guinea last month, and it's a great example of how challenging it can be to make sure that national governments oversee mining companies effectively. And that's why we think it's so important that downstream actors, car companies, and other end users of aluminum start to play a more assertive and more effective role in making sure that communities' rights are respected all the way down through the supply chain. So to answer your question, Johannes, First of all, we think that the raw materials outlook is a great starting point for a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, we see it really reflecting an increased kind of political commitment, an increased engagement and commitment to understanding risks in the aluminum supply chain and to trying to address them. That's hugely welcome. It also has, as others have said, really comprehensive information, both about the kind of general elements of the supply chain, where sourcing is coming from, what companies, and what the ultimate kind of connection to the car industry is. And certainly, as Rosa said, a really exhaustive description of risk. So I want to talk a bit more about what we can do to build on that. The first thing, which is undoubtedly a recommendation that you've heard before, and that many companies have heard before, is that we still think it's really important that car companies map their own specific supply chains. So the raw materials outlook is industry-wide. We think companies still need to map their own supply chains specifically. We've seen in Guinea in the last few months, and we've spoken to many of the car companies in Drive Sustainability about this, that car companies can have real impact where they're engaging with a specific mining company that they know is in their supply chain about a specific human rights grievance from a group of communities. And so we want car companies to work towards situations where they're able to use their power and influence with that specific grievance, with a set of communities specifically, more often. And so, as difficult as it is and as complex as that is, that means that we think companies need to start mapping their supply chain. We know that aluminum is different from materials like cobalt. And so we know that there are a lot of aluminum products in a car, and there's a very complex supply chain. But we also think that you can begin with high-risk areas like Guinea, try to identify your connections to some of the major players in Guinea, which is a fairly limited set of companies, and try to address the human rights issues that relate to those companies. The second thing I want to talk about is certification. I think that the car industry at the moment, at least those car companies who have been kind of most active on aluminum, have seen certification as a great tool. We don't disagree with that. We think that certification can really increase transparency in supply chains by assessing standards and by assessing mining facilities and refineries and smelters against human rights and environmental standards. But we also understand that certification has limitations, and the clearest one is that you need to put pressure on your supply chain to actually certify and to produce certified material. And in Guinea, which is now responsible for about a quarter of all global bauxite production, there is no mining operation in Guinea certified by ASI, by the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. So does that mean that the car industry isn't pushing enough, isn't creating enough demand for certified material? The second thing we'd say is that certification has limits and is only as effective as a certification scheme itself. It's only as effective as the transparency and accountability present in a certification scheme. And that's why, as we talk about legislation at the EU level, we think it's really important that certification on its own isn't evidence of a company's respect for mandatory human rights due diligence, and that car companies will need to continue to do more beyond certification to show that they're assessing and identifying and addressing risks in their supply chain. But in aluminum specifically, and talking about ASI, we would really encourage car companies that are members of ASI or that are considering joining ASI to use their influence as much as possible to make sure that ASI upholds the highest human rights and environmental standards. And one key way that we think ASI can do that is by being more transparent about the results of the audits that it does of mining companies, so that it's really clear how audits were conducted, who the auditors spoke to, particularly whether and how communities were consulted, and then ultimately what needs to change at that mining company or refinery so that it respects human rights standards. And we'd really encourage, as we'd said, car companies to engage with ASI and to engage with other parts of the aluminum industry to make sure that certification upholds the highest standards possible. I think that's kind of the recommendations that the car companies, that reflect kind of how car companies are addressing aluminum right now. That's to say, looking at supply chain mapping, looking at tools like the platform that we're discussing today, and looking at certification. And then I just want to end by saying that means that there's a lot that we don't know what to do. There's a lot of questions that are unanswered, including for organizations like Human Rights Watch, who've spent the last year trying to kind of raise the profile of aluminum as a risk sector. And I think it's really great that as you look at the raw materials outlook and you look at Drive Sustainability's plan, you have 2025 as kind of a date to move through which you're going to move towards collective action. And obviously, hopefully, collective action happens well before then. And we'd love to be part of that conversation. I just want to kind of raise some questions that I think should come up in that discussion. The first of which is that, as others have said, the aluminum sector is vertically integrated. There are companies who are involved in mining, refining, and smelting. And the fact that there are vertically integrated companies means that maybe car companies can collectively engage with those big players in the aluminum sector and try to drive up standards all the way through the supply chain for those big players. So is that something that car companies can do as they look to collective action? The second question I want to raise is car companies, I think, may have some challenges getting enough market power to actually influence those really big players. So is there an opportunity for car companies to partner with other end users, other sectors, to try to even amplify further the pressure beyond Drive Sustainability? And how can that happen? And then the final question is, what's the right forum for all of this engagement? Do we need a new forum? There's obviously a lot of different fora out there, including ASI, including other Responsible Minerals Initiative type fora. And what's the right forum for engagement for aluminum specifically? How can we make sure we have enough communication across the industry? And from our perspective, how can we ensure that communities are really represented in that discussion? So we'd love to be part of that. I know that's just the beginning, but I think this is such an important conversation, and I really hope that the conversation and launch that we've had today can be the starting point.
Thank you, Jim. Very interesting to listen to you as usual, I must say. And thank you also for the comments related to ASI. I think there's at least one person on the panel who would wholeheartedly agree on a lot of what you said. So we'll pick that up in a second. But I would like to add another perspective in between, and that is Henrik, and that indeed is a very different viewpoint. Henrik, you work for a company that is processing aluminium, and you have shifted to using secondary sources of aluminium, mostly with sustainability in mind. So a question to you would then be, now with the raw materials outlook published, what tools are needed from your perspective in addition, or going forward in general, to improve your due diligence or your due diligence issues that you see in your supply chain? And maybe adding to that, also, what would you expect from a certification such as the one that the Aluminium Stewardship is offering to achieve this? Over to you.
Thank you, Johannes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad to participate and talk during this panel discussion. I work for August Industries, as mentioned, Head of Quality and Sustainability. August, we are a Tier 1 supplier within the automotive industry sector. We're also a member of the Drive Plus project, which is connected and driven by the Drive Sustainability organization. As you mentioned, Johannes, August, we have, from a sustainability point of view, moved more into the recycled part of aluminum. So we have reduced our level of primary aluminum, of course, with the sustainability in mind, to reduce emissions and greenhouse gases. But when we look into our supply chain, it is very hard for our supply chain and us to really go to further down in the supply chain to really find out where the primer aluminum is origin from, especially when we want to trace back to the bauxite mining. Many of our partners in our supply chain today has big problems of actually doing so. When we talk to our partners within our supply chain, they also tell us that they are missing proper tools for it. So also coming back to a little bit to what Jim was talking about here earlier, within the automotive sector, we are also missing clear requirements and expectations from our OEM customers. We get a lot of questions from them with different angles, but it's hard for us to really understand what is expected, what is the requirements. We really would like to see that, take for instance the Drive Sustainability organization, the first of all the members there to more collaborate and go together and unify more clear expectations, requirements on us as a tier 1 supplier, that we also easier can cascade downwards in the supply chain. That will be much more helpful for us, because also when we talk to our partners in our supply chain, they are asking us what is the requirements. But then when we don't get clear, I would say, expectations from our customers, it is hard for us to meet that. We're missing tools for it properly. So if we look in our supply chains, what our suppliers are primarily doing, then they try from code of conduct point of view, from different policies, etc. Sourcing of conflict minerals, to have a good policy for that and trying to secure it as much as possible. But we are missing tools for it, that's for sure. And I think the big benefit would be if as Jim also was talking about, that the automotive sector, big OEMs would go together, unify more common expectations. That would be putting more pressure downwards also in the supply chain. And from a certification point of view, when we talk to our partners about ASI, for instance, ASI is known, but not many are a member of it, and discussions are ongoing. Yeah, should we be a member of it? What would be the benefit of it? Is that a requirement or expectations? So there is a lot of questions like that. So at the moment, as a tier 1 supplier within the automotive sector, it's hard for us actually to know in which direction we should go. We for sure really want to do a huge impact, but it's hard for us we can't do it by ourselves. We need to have the big OEMs together with us and to be able to support them and then cascade that down in the supply chain. Thank you. I think that was...
Thank you, Henrik. This is a very interesting perspective, because it is very oftentimes missed actually to include the perspective of a tier 1 supplier or even midstream companies, and to hear and see their own challenges in that regard. So very interesting to hear that. And maybe that fits actually quite well, handing over to Marike last, but by far not least, because in a lot of sense you are the anchor point of this panel. Obviously aluminium stewardship is the most widespread certification scheme in the aluminium supply chain, but it's also a multi-stakeholder initiative, and that brings us very closely together regarding what we've been trying to do with the raw materials outlook, because of course that is a source of information and it very well can stand on its own. But for us, it is also very much the start of a great engagement, as was mentioned previously, to get closer to the automotive supply chains and engage more with the stakeholders. Down the raw material supply chains in general. And therefore, just looking ahead, what kind of engagement from an ASI perspective would you wish for, or would you like to see? Actually, let's make it more profound from the DS members, from the Drive Sustainability members.
Great, thank you very much, Johannes. And first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak during this panel session on responsible sourcing of aluminium, and also congratulations on the launch of the raw materials outlook today. So I'm a Director of Impacts and Partnerships at ASI, and so I'm responsible for measuring the outcomes and impacts of ASI's work, which is of course a critical question, but also driving partnerships and collaborations with other initiatives and standards that are out there, including Drive Sustainability, and we very much welcome the collaboration moving forward. So as many of you know, ASI is indeed a global non-for-profit standard setting and certification organization, and we bring together producers, users, stakeholders in the aluminium value chain with a commitment to maximize the contribution of aluminium to a sustainable society. And working together, we aim to collaboratively foster the responsible production, sourcing and stewardship, so recycling of aluminium. We currently have almost 200 members and growing quickly, which is very exciting, across 6 different membership classes, with currently more than 140 certificates issued against the performance standard and the chain of custody standard. So we run an independent third-party certification program that offers 2 complementary standards: the performance standard, which sets out the practices for sustainability and human rights principles to be applied by companies along the value chain, and then also this chain of custody standard, which creates a link from company practices to responsible sourcing of products by connecting certified suppliers and customers and accounting for material flow. So we very much welcome the greater engagement from Drive Sustainability and its members in identifying risks through the raw materials outlook that was launched. And we think it provides a very much valuable information, and is definitely a next level from the material change report that was published a few years ago. And we've also been happy to review a draft of it, and of course ASI and Drive have members in common as well. And like I said, we very much look forward to continue working together to advance our collective goals, and also to see perhaps in the raw materials outlook engagement and efforts that have already been made by supply chain initiatives in there as well, to get that insight. So we think that it is a great start of engagement into identifying risks and issues in the automotive supply chain. And the next step, of course, and this was also already mentioned by some of the other panelists, but is not only to identify the risks, but also to manage and mitigate those risks, including, of course, human rights risks, but also, of course, across all the ESG issues. So a great next step would be for Drive Sustainability members to ensure that appropriate systems are in place for critical risk management along the value chain. Automotive companies with, of course, diverse material flows will be challenged to ensure such systems are deployed along the full value chain, which is where certification systems such as ASI can come in. ASI is at the moment the only responsible sourcing program that addresses practices along the full aluminium value chain, from, of course, its mined or recycled source through then each step in the value chain in accordance with the standards that we've set. And ASI certification against both the performance standard and the chain of custody standard provides that assurance that responsible practices and responsible sourcing for aluminium. In terms of uptake, this is of course very important and also touched on by Jim. We launched our certification program at the end of 2017. And like I said before, as of now, we have more than 140 certificates issued across 40 countries throughout the value chain, not yet in Guinea, but we have our first member from there that has joined recently, so they do need to get certified within 2 years of joining. And for the last calendar year, 2020, the share of global bauxite mining production from sites that are ASI certified against both the performance standard and the chain of custody standard was around 16%.
And from a site perspective, and looking at primary production of aluminium, there are at least 11% of the world's bauxite mines, 11% of alumina refiners, and 20% of aluminium smelters ASI Performance Standard certified. So just after 3 years of rollout, that is quite already strong progress for a young initiative. We recognize, of course, that certification schemes are not a panacea. They do come with their own risks, but they do provide that level of assurance that otherwise may not exist. Currently, we are also in a standards revision process that's we've for the last 2 years, and we are looking, of course, to always improve the criteria that are in the standards, but also the assurance system. And in terms of transparency, that's, of course, a very important issue for ASI. We are strongly committed to transparency. We currently publish summary audit reports, but through the standards revision, we're looking to publish more information from the audit and the audit process and methodology in the future as well. So to sum up, we very much welcome working together with all stakeholders to ensure that we are continually improving. We recognize that these are complex issues, and we kind of need to work together with a range of stakeholders to make sure that that we are all driving towards collective and reaching our respective goals, including, of course, human rights due diligence. So that was it from me, and I look forward also to the questions that we hopefully have some time left for.
Thank you so much, Marieke. Yeah, about timing. So we are already very late, actually. And I think we've answered a few questions in the chat already, sort of just in parallel. And I wanted to use the opportunity to just, throw one quick question at all of you simultaneously. And actually on a point that was raised by Henrik, and that I can only second from experiences that we have when we talk with our direct suppliers, tier 1 to tier 5 of aluminium. There seems to be a neglect of these suppliers on these tier levels. At least that's what I would read from the conversation. That's also part of the experience that we are making. That these companies are not really taking part in the sustainability debate when it comes to bauxite and aluminium. And the question that I would like to raise is, how do we engage these companies more and better? How do we motivate them to become ASI members? How do we engage them in a discussion? Basically any comments on how to solve this would be highly appreciated from all of you. Whoever wants to go first.
I can have a quick crack at it, if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
So I think, just stealing part of Jim's point earlier, it is very much about demand. So demand for sustainable, responsible aluminium coming from well-managed sites that are contributing positive outcomes to a landscape. So I think that's one really key point. The second one is that, again, possibly Jim mentioned this as well, so I might be stealing another one of your points, Jim, but the fact that standard certification alone are not going to do it. There's a lot of good sort of research on governance that shows that unless standards sort of can drive stronger legislation, we're ultimately not going to see the outcomes that we need.
Thank you, Samir. Maybe looking at Jim, did Samir leave any points for you left, or did he mention everything that you had to say?
Yeah, no, thanks, Yannis, and thanks, Samir. I mean, I think that, first of all, just that point on demand, absolutely. I think that what I'd say kind of in follow-up to that is what we don't know yet, I think, is also kind of how the market will change if that demand really comes forcibly. I think one way it could change is through an uptick in certification. But hopefully it will also change through a much clearer commitment to traceability that Henrik mentioned. That, he mentioned when he talks to his suppliers, they don't have an easy answer on traceability. there are answers to traceability out there, one of which is chain of custody from ASI, another of which is potential technological innovations around how you label raw materials as it goes up through the supply chain. And so I think kind of from a market perspective, you would expect that if you change the demand, that then the market will adapt. But I also think to your points on sort of integrating different companies into the discussion, then that's going to be something that's important too, and that I think that we will have a responsibility to try to reach out to those companies and include them in these discussions.
Thank you, Jim. Any further comments? Otherwise, I'm waiting for Catalina to intervene and cut off the event, basically.
Well, the fact that we are actually running out of time, it's a proof that we need to continue the discussion. There are a lot of some comments earlier about what is the right fora for this type of discussion, and about the fact that, of course, collaboration and engaging in discussion with different stakeholders is needed. What we wanted to do as Drive Sustainability today is, of course, we wanted to launch the raw materials outlook, but also the raw materials outlook has a public space there, and the purpose of the public space there is also to put information out there publicly. So this is to say that we wanted to have this discussion in an open fora, but for sure we will continue it as Drive Sustainability, and also as probably the automotive companies individually, because as you've heard, there are expectations for companies individually as well. What I want to actually say in closing, what's next for Drive Sustainability, besides what I just said, is that, of course, we are waiting for the other research to come in. Right now, there are 10, there should be 10 profiles on the portal. There are only 4. So we are looking for the others to come in the next period. We are going to take some time to digest that. And we are also working on the plan for 2022. So this is a very good timing for us to have this discussion and to reflect on what should be next steps. Other than that, I would recommend that you keep also an eye on the next sessions in the SDG Summit. On 14th of October, there are quite some few interesting sessions on sustainable sourcing or responsible supply chains. So please have a look at that. In the end, I would just like to thank all the speakers and all the panelists for the interesting discussion. And I would like to thank you, all the attendees, for being here today. So thank you and have a good rest of the day.